Start walking inland from Lüderitz, the southernmost coastal town in the African state of Namibia. Go a few miles and you will enter the Namib, a desert that, to the uninitiated, seems like sand, sand, and still more sand. The portion of the Namib to the south and east of Lüderitz is known as the Forbidden Zone. Despite amounting to just 5% of Namibia's overall land, the Forbidden Zone consists of a vast terrain the size of Maryland. Talking about the portion essentially from that dot down to the border. You'll see the name here in German. Many of Lüderitz's roughly 12,000 inhabitants work in the Forbidden Zone. It's a place that induces fear beyond that attending most wildernesses. Signs on the area's outskirts warn trespassers of arrest and hefty fines. But anyone authorized to enter the Forbidden Zone, or the Zone for short, already knows that it is nigh impossible to survive there without assistance. No fresh water sources exist inside the zone, despite the ground's contiguity with the cold, powerful waves of the southern Atlantic. Annual rainfall there averages 1/4 of an inch. Droughts have lasted as long as 6 years, and while thick morning fog provides enough moisture to keep ants and beetles alive, humans are not so lucky. Nights in the zone often turn freezing. Daytime temperatures can surpass 120 degrees Fahrenheit, sometimes reaching 140 in the canyons. Vegetation cannot survive such extremes, rendering the ground barren and lunar-like. Only the wind has staying power, whipping up dust without apparent pause. Sand gets in the throats and eyes of human travelers. The grains prick, cut, and sting. Imperceptibly at first, then absolutely, the sand lodges under shoe soles as if in an attempt to escape. Climate is one reason why the zone figures in travel guides as an eerie corner of the globe. But one must recall, too, that a man-made prohibition has forbidden this place. Clinging to an orange-brown expanse of rock beneath shifting dunes that can grow to several hundred feet in height, the history of the zone's prohibition lies buried amidst the ruins of the lost empire that created it. Today one finds traces of that empire scattered across an uninhabited patchwork of ghost towns, rusted machinery, decrepit bungalows, and abandoned ditches filled with unidentified skeletons. Tying it all together are millions of tiny stones that, because prized by the world, have contributed to a long, bloody domination of this African land by Europeans. The territory that became the zone won little attention until 1908, when railroad workers found troves of diamonds beside some track under repair. At the time, Namibia did not exist as a sovereign state. Instead, Germany ruled it as a colony named Southwest Africa. The diamond strike thus originally promised to benefit not Namibians, but Germany's colonial government. The Germans claimed ownership of what were, by multiple accounts, then the richest diamond deposits in history. Their reserves doubled what India and Brazil had produced in centuries of mining, even approaching the equivalent weight of all diamonds extracted by humans prior to the 20th century. More astonishingly, as one contemporary account put it, the German-controlled diamonds lay strewn about the Namib Desert like apples under a shaken tree that one had simply to stoop down to pick up. After 1908, Southwest Africa's German occupiers worried about protecting their mineral wealth from perceived interlopers, theft, and chaos. As a result, colonial authorities sealed off most of the Namib from the public, reclassifying the affected area as the Forbidden Zone, or Sperrgebiet in German. The zone now had the potential to change an array of fortunes for consumers who coveted diamonds for jewelry, for bankers who aimed to monetize dubious deeds of colonial ownership, for officials in the colonies who tried to elevate their second-rate posting, for fringe prospectors who hoped to strike it rich, for stock jobbers who built a speculative house of cards atop diamond fantasies, and not least for Wilhelmine political elites who dreamt of turning imperial ambitions into the global influence enjoyed by Britain. My book manuscript, tentatively titled Blood and Diamonds, charts the rise and fall of Germany's colonial diamond wealth as a means to reassess Germany's short-lived, and very short-lived in some ways, overseas empire. So what was this overseas empire? It was, in a lot of respects, a ramshackle agglomeration of experiments undertaken in Africa, the Pacific, and China. Lasting roughly from 1884 to 1918, the German overseas empire amounted to an area 5 times the size of Imperial Germany proper, or about 1/3 of the United States, including Alaska today. The Germans' inaugural signature overseas holding was Southwest Africa. Entering 1908, when diamonds turned up in droves in Southwest Africa, the colony faced deep problems: administrative corruption, economic stagnation, inadequate European settlement, and the aftershocks of a brutal military campaign that nearly annihilated two indigenous peoples. Southwest Africa's problems figured as an indictment of Germany's broader colonial project, about which scandals proliferated and for which even apologists struggled to excuse parlous budgets. Germany was a fledgling colonizer, having joined in on Africa's partition later than did its rivals France and Britain. That said, Germany was also a mighty scientific and industrial nation, the value of whose exports topped out at 10 billion marks annually in the years before 1914. It thus seemed difficult to explain the country's perceived underperformance in Southwest Africa or elsewhere. Standard accounts stress how, despite Imperial Germany's prowess, its overseas colonies never contributed more than a marginal 0.5% of total German exports. I apologize for the rather boring graphic here. Such a damning number, which diverse critics have reiterated from the turn of the century, leads historians to regard German colonialism as economically inconsequential. But this interpretation starts to look questionable when examining German colonial history through the prism of the diamond, and in terms of that stone's global exposure, rather than solely in its direct contributions to mainland Germany. One scholar has recently written that between 1908 and 1913, Southwest Africa exported 52 million marks worth of diamonds in total. However, in transcripts from a parliamentary investigation held in 1913, a director of the De Beers Corporation testified that German Southwest Africa's licit diamond exports, just in 1 year, 1912, equaled 50 million marks. In 1913, the annual figure actually rose to about 60 million marks, meaning the Germans shipped out more in value from their colony that year than the Belgians did from their notoriously rapacious regime in the Congo. In an additional complication, German diamond exports emerged in an era when smuggling out of Southwest Africa was so rampant that real diamond output outstripped reported levels by a factor of at least 2. Extrapolating from such information about illicit activity, I think we can credibly consider the true export value of Southwest Africa's diamonds in, say, 1913 or the years approaching 1914 to have approximated something more like 120 million marks. Now, I know that's a lot of data, but on the strength of that data, I think it becomes a little more necessary to take another look at trade statistics for German colonies in the aggregate. Here again, if we do the math and add in the other German colonies as well as Tsingtao, we get something that actually looks a lot more like, say, 300 million marks, if you include the illicit figures, smuggling figures. And in view of that, what is assumed to have been this pathetic colonial share of 0.5% in Germany's overall exports of 10 billion instead becomes something like 2.5 to 3%. Now, that distinction hardly means Germany's colonies were as important economically as France's or Britain's, nor does it detract from the fact that Germany's colonies were unsuccessful at attracting European settlers. Nonetheless, the new math suggests a need to re-examine the anatomy of the German colonial economy. There was more money motivating this colonial regime and more money generated from its exploitation of indigenous peoples than has been acknowledged in current scholarly dismissals. To grasp those dynamics more completely, one has to look not only beyond the German nation in Europe, but beyond German colonies overseas. A good start is to trace the transatlantic web that supplied diamond jewelry, a substantial, if secretive, market in which Germans came to control 20% of global production before the First World War. In the years preceding 1914, nearly all of the world's uncut rough diamonds came from South and Southwest Africa, where colonial merchants assessed and priced stones before exporting them to Europe. Most rough diamonds were subsequently cut in Antwerp or Amsterdam, after which the price of a diamond jumped from an average of around 50 German marks per carat to an average of 100. In roughly 75% of cases, the cut diamonds then departed Europe for the United States, where their price per carat again rose upon arrival, now to an average of around 150 marks. Ultimately, by the time each diamond found its way into the display cases of American jewelry shops, or say to a Sears catalog, prices had risen to as much as 20 times the value assigned at the moment of extraction from Africa. Determining how much wealth this process captured is fundamental to understanding the allure that diamonds held for German colonialism, whose biggest customers actually lived in the United States. Around the turn of the 20th century, reputable international observers alleged that statistics issued by European governments concealed the amounts of money at stake in the global diamond trade. In keeping with that repression of information, diamond merchants declined to publish the number of carats the United States imported. Still, an American Trade Association report estimated the United States annual consumption in 1913 to be something like 1.15 million carats in weight. And working on that knowledge about the value chain, it is conceivable that in, say, a single year before World War I, Americans transferred about 1.15 billion German marks worth of money in exchange for retail diamonds. Assuming similar machinations took place in the remaining 25% of the world's diamond market, one could surmise that the diamond business yielded something approaching 1.4 billion marks in revenue in 1913. So what does that mean in 1913? A sum of 1.4 billion marks would easily have surpassed what Germany was said to have spent cumulatively on all its colonial governing expenses between 1884 and 1918. Further, 1.4 billion marks in 1913 would have matched the combined cash value from annual sales of Germany's two leading exports, machines and ironwares. Seen differently, 1.4 billion marks would have represented half the national wealth of Luxembourg, already a rich microstate. In other words, this was serious and significant money. And like slavery, sugar, and cotton, diamonds attested to the impact that the global periphery could have on the global economy. The second point I would like to make is that statistics about German colonialism, not least import and export figures like these, never encapsulated the importance of the diamond boom for colonial stock speculation in Germany. After the diamond discoveries in 1908, German colonial stocks turned over massive amounts of money. Concomitantly, they caused dislocations in overall investment by crowding out the buying of non-colonial stocks and by fueling a bubble in colonial investment. Diamond successes, heavily hyped in Germany through advertising and readily reported on in newspapers and domestic investment catalogs, stimulated broader interest in colonial-themed stocks to such an extent that they induced the founding of hundreds of new colonial companies both within and without the German Empire proper, as well as a surge in railroad building. Beyond arguments about German colonial economics, I believe the history of Namibian diamonds has something to tell us about empire more broadly. Contemporaneously with Southern Africa's diamond boom, J.A. Hobson published a best-selling critique of empire because there was widespread credulousness for his argument that Britain's colonies in colonial wars did taxpayers more harm than good. To great acclaim, Norman Angell, John Maynard Keynes, and even Vladimir Lenin later picked up Hobson's line of inquiry. I'm sure you're all waiting for that. Today I would like to reflect on and potentially revise those arguments. In the case of the German diamonds, it is not enough to say that imperialism did not pay, but it also goes too far to throw out Hobson's original thesis. If we revise Hobson by keeping the diamond story in mind, we will see that imperialism was an often misadvertised process in which various European institutions channeled swaths of public funds and colonial wealth to private parties. To insist only that Europeans as a whole lost and acted irrationally is to miss a crucial point. Namely, that without illusions of value, and without the skillful creation of demand, none of it would have been possible. Diamonds proved an ideal vehicle for transfers of wealth from and for colonies. As I will argue, the diamond's peculiar mix of prestige and value also singularly reflected a conflict at the heart of European colonialism, a conflict over nothing less than its purpose. To start the case for revisions, we have to understand that a quest for minerals partly motivated the launch of German overseas colonialism in 1884, especially in its inaugural holding, Southwest Africa. The diamond fields Germans eventually found in the colony existed on land allegedly acquired from the Nama and San peoples. The chief vehicle for this acquisition was a series of dubious treaties forged by a German adventurer during the 1880s, in the early days of colonial rule. The adventurer in question, a Bremen merchant named Adolf Luderitz, hoped to find diamonds in the Nama Desert and insisted to prospective German investors, around 1884, that he would do so. Over the years that followed, Luderitz's successors, among them the German military, expropriated Nama and San partly with an eye towards occupying specific lands thought likely to contain diamonds. Archived sources attest the consistency of this determination. One such document, written in 1904, records Chancellor Bülow briefing Kaiser Wilhelm II on supposedly imminent diamond finds in Southwest Africa, just as the Kaiser was also pondering the genocidal violence in the colony. German taxpayers paid for the occupation of Southwest African land in blood. The blood of indigenous peoples annihilated in a genocidal campaign, and the blood of young Germans sent to fight a war overseas. Yet, from the moment the German diamonds were discovered in 1908, the overwhelming majority of the German population experienced no palpable gains from colonial wealth, this despite the diamond's massive enrichment of select parties in Germany. The discrepancy owed to several factors. To begin, physical access to diamond wealth in Namibia, in German-occupied Namibia, was immediately cut off through law. According to the original treaties that underpinned German colonialism in Southwest Africa, sovereignty over the diamond fields lay not entirely with the German state proper, but partly with a colonial company, the German Colonial Corporation for Southwest Africa. The German state had been meaning to buy out the German Colonial Corporation's claims to partial sovereignty in early 1908, more or less contemporaneously with Belgium's purchase of Leopold II's privately held sovereign rights in the Congo. It was the thing to do at that time. But then the diamond discoveries in the Namib came around and changed everything. How could such a bizarre situation emerge? In 1885, the aforementioned Adolf Luderitz, the merchant who was celebrated as the first ruler of German Southwest Africa, sold all his property to the German Colonial Corporation. At the time, no one quite knew what that property entailed. Luderitz had made his name on the strength of 2 contracts produced with a Nama chief, Joseph Fredericks, in 1883. The contracts were more or less legitimate sales of land, made with the more or less informed consent of Fredericks. Luderitz, though, fraudulently edited the contracts and aggrandized his claims once back in Europe, to the point that the contracts became treaties, and the sale of land became the sale of Fredericks' sovereign rights, so-called, over a portion of a kingdom. For a variety of domestic and foreign policy reasons, Otto von Bismarck chose to embrace Luderitz's generous interpretation and to see it endorsed by other European powers at the Berlin Africa Conference in 1884 and 1885. This was the very moment when Leopold II, George Goldie, and other European businessmen won recognition for their own dubious, privately held sovereign rights claims in Africa. Adolf Luderitz was henceforth to stand as the sovereign ruler on paper of Luderitz land, with Luderitz land existing in a sort of confederal relationship to the German Empire proper. In 1885, as mentioned, Bismarck went on to recognize not only this, but a series of private colonial regimes based on Luderitz's model. Southwest Africa, but also in Cameroon, Togo, New Guinea, and East Africa. Each place was, in theory, supposed to be run by German corporations, or by individuals like Luderitz, who would hold most sovereign rights, aka Landeshoheit, after buying them from indigenous polities. Out of this morass, a colonial system would supposedly emerge with only the smallest of contributions and oversight from Germany proper. Germany would retain a titular sovereign right, aka Oberhoheit, either via transfer from these German private parties, or more rarely from the indigenous polities themselves. Over time, this system of private sovereigns saw the so-called private sovereigns unwilling or incapable with regard to governing. Hence, Bismarck's system underwent repeated adjustments. In Southwest Africa, Germany initially announced that it would share sovereign rights with a business run by Adolf Luderitz. Not just in the Namib, but across a much larger area, in which Germany had signed protection treaties with indigenous tribes like the Herero. Such an arrangement never got off the ground. In fact, it did not even take hold in the former Luderitz land, where the inheritors of Adolf Luderitz's estate, the Colonial Corporation, bowed out and chose to say Germany owned most sovereign rights, at least until diamonds were found. This early vacillation seemed to confirm the complaints of prominent European skeptics, who counseled against leaving sovereign rights in the hands of private parties. Nonetheless, the trend continued. In 1888, when salted fields led speculators to think a gold rush was on in the Namib Desert, Germany, eager to help the corporation attract investors, issued a proclamation declaring that the corporation still owned a sovereign right to adjudicate, without oversight from the German state or its colonial authorities, all matters related to mining in Southwest Africa. Only 1 year later, Germany's position underwent yet another modification. Now Germany said the scope of the corporation's mining sovereignty, as they called it, was limited to the very southern part of the Namib Desert, specifically the area for which Luderitz had signed his original treaties in 1883 and 1884. From 1908 on, once the diamonds were discovered, by virtue of its putative retention of a single sovereign right, the corporation intended to stand pat and collect major annual rents from the diamond boom. Each diamond mining business in the corporation's territory had to pay the corporation royalties. Moreover, because the corporation had a sovereign right to control mining permits, as it asserted it, the corporation could regulate operations such that only large mining companies owned by large German banks, whose ranks conveniently made up the bulk of the corporation's shareholders, succeeded. Meanwhile, the corporation watched its own shares skyrocket in value and surreptitiously began cashing in on the difference, though without selling off a majority stake. Over the ensuing years, elite private parties, many of them heavy-hitter executives at Germany's large D-banks, made enormous profits on several levels. These elites controlled first the corporation, second the new German diamond mining companies the corporation was setting up and granting coveted mining permits, third the monopoly organization established by the German government to evaluate and market all diamonds from Southwest Africa. For its part, the German government not only reaffirmed the corporation's sovereign right in order that the company might keep competitors away and reap maximum profits from the incipient diamond boom, the German Colonial Office also went so far as to help the corporation fence off most of the southern Namib Desert and implement a prohibition on unauthorized entry, including entry by state officials in some cases. The corporation's territory now became reclassified as the Forbidden Zone, a stretch of desert with whose description I began my presentation. Inside this zone, according to the German government, diamond extraction could occur only with the corporation's permission and on its terms. Outside the zone, meanwhile, the government took two additional steps to shut out European civilians. First, any diamond possession unauthorized by the government and the corporation was outlawed in Southwest Africa. Second, once German diamonds made their way back to Europe for evaluation by a consortium of the large banks behind the corporation, the German government decreed that the diamonds in German custody must be cut by the corporation's preferred dealers, who were based in Antwerp and not, crucially, in the German jewelry cutting centers near Frankfurt. This was interesting because the corporation happened allegedly to have a stake in Antwerp diamond cutters. Many German politicians in the parliamentary opposition were outraged once news about the Forbidden Zone and the diamond laws leaked. Led by a young Matthias Erzberger, they argued that German taxpayers had earned a right to the Forbidden Zone, as well as a bigger cut of the diamond money this zone was yielding. The government had approved massive expenditures on railroads and on colonial infrastructure, starting in the 1890s. The government had paid for German soldiers to slaughter the Nama and Herero between 1904 and 1907, just before the diamond finds popped up. Erzberger and his colleagues therefore proceeded to rail against the colonial corporation, which had paid nothing, and whose sovereign right strangely lingered past 1908 and into the heyday of the German diamond industry. The corporation, collecting what Erzberger called million-dollar gifts, looked like an atavism, for upon its putative sovereign right rested a foundational impediment to the nationalization of a diamond business and a more equitable distribution of wealth among the colonial occupiers. Internally, however, the German government struggled to challenge the status quo because they feared it would undermine the prestige of their state and because it would possibly compromise the public's faith in the whole colonial venture, which also, like these machinations of illiterates I talked about, depended on highly dubious treaties for much of its legitimacy. Perhaps the strongest case for reform of colonial diamonds could be found in German equity trading. As news of Namib's fabulous diamond wealth spread, a mania gripped stock exchanges across Germany, in Berlin, Hamburg, Frankfurt, Dresden, Breslau, Magdeburg, and more than a dozen other cities. There were a lot of stock exchanges at the time. In mere months, German traders dramatically drove up share prices for German companies in the diamond business. They even drove up the share price of quite a few fake colonial companies that had no business at all. One astonished stock consultant, upon inspecting the Namibian fields, secretly assured the bankers backing large diamond miners that they could expect billions of marks in exchange for virtually no effort. In the case of the corporation, accordingly, shares experienced their most meteoric rise of all. Though largely unknown to the German public just a few months earlier, the corporation claimed the status of Germany's most coveted stock in 1909. Prior to the Namib discoveries, the corporation's shares traded around a 175% premium relative to face value. By mid-1909, with the Forbidden Zone declared and put in place, German traders drove up the price of this stock to a staggering 2,000% relative to face value. Since the Great Crash of 1873, the German government had mandated that traditional stock shares be sold in increments large enough to deter average investors from participation. Colonial shares, however, were a different matter. Indeed, in an effort to attract investment, the German government had recently lowered the threshold for colonial share issuance by a factor of 10, such that anyone with around 100 marks could now buy a share. This innovation, along with breathless promotion of diamond wealth and reporting on its winners, fueled a frenzy for colonial diamond shares to such an extent that it caused an overall stock bubble. The bubble enticed working and middle classes because German newspapers crowed widely about how enormous stock gains were turning even small diamond shareholders into multimillionaires overnight. Behind the scenes, insiders were timing sales of their shares to accord with the strategic and often illicit release of information about finds and profits. Elsewhere, heavy buying of shares was occurring on the strength of speculators who were agnostic about diamonds, but who sought to ride market momentum. In general, these speculators told themselves that it was better to go ahead and buy some shares before results about diamond production proved consistent, because afterwards the course of the shares would naturally trend upwards even more. For a time, this diamond stock bubble worked. In December 1908, an anonymous party purchased shares of a newly formed diamond miner for 100 marks, only to receive an offer a few weeks later of 40,000 marks for these same shares, with just a few diamonds having appeared in the stock's territory. A well-placed source in Berlin, boasting about never setting foot in Africa, invested 50,000 marks and walked away with 500,000 3 months later. With an extraordinarily harsh winter setting in across Berlin, these success stories brought enormous expanses of the Nama and colonialism nearer to European culture. As the subject of numerous publications for lawyers, for fairy tale investment prospectuses, and even for popular adventure stories, like those of Hans Grimm, Southwest Diamonds arguably did more than anything else to generate interest in Germany's colonial project. Wilhelm II proved a case in point. Usually indifferent to colonial developments, the Kaiser entered 1909 talking about Southwest African diamonds for days on end, his expectations building with each account. He promised active assistance and even proposed elevating Bernhard Dernburg, the colonial secretary who was encouraging stock market investment, to the position of chancellor. He needed one at the time. Prior to the diamond boom, arguably the hottest stock in Germany was the Gelsenkirchen coal firm, an El Dorado, according to journalists of the time, because the stock paid an 11% dividend. Now compare that to the Coloniale Bergbaugesellschaft, a typical German colonial diamond miner. This company paid dividends of 1,300% in 1909, 2,400% in 1910, 2,500% in 1911, and a staggering 3,800% in 1912. In other words, dividends turned many privileged shareholders into millionaires. But there was a rub here for average and working class Germans. Colonial share trading, while lucrative, was not only more volatile than usual equity activity, it was more prone than typical trading to insider manipulation, promotional misrepresentations, pump and dump schemes, and broker malfeasance. The whole colonial stock market was virtually unregulated. Low-information German investors did not have access to accurate reports on diamond values, profits, or location. That data remained the prerogative of government insiders and of select companies connected to the Colonial Corporation, many of whom already fudged information to evade taxes. Moreover, low-information German investors did not know that trading in colonial diamond stock took place around rather than on traditional German stock exchanges. With colonial diamond shares unlisted, and therefore the subject of oversight only by the German Colonial Office, an understaffed, nascent part of the government that was incestuously tied to the diamond companies it would theoretically regulate. As a result, many German diamond share buyers failed to understand the legal implications or risks attending their investment. These buyers widely struggled also to distinguish between reputable and disreputable promoters, given the fantastic nature of diamonds that already sat in the desert. Colonial authorities took a rather indifferent approach to regulation, as I mentioned. Mostly they laid back and collected heavy taxes on a grossly inflated volume of stock transactions. Into this regulatory vacuum, would-be millionaires found themselves left with two undesirable options. First, they could go through brokerage houses, the only legally authorized dealers in colonial shares, or second, they could go through illicit mechanisms such as bucket shops. The first option, authorized brokers, were often coextensive with the large German banks running the Colonial Corporation and the large diamond miners that also belonged to that corporation. These brokers took special advantage of lacking regulation when it came to the ignorant investors, levying excessive fees, buying and selling in batches in ways that were unfair, misleading consumers about risk, and failing to deliver information they possessed that might deter buying or selling at times most advantageous for the client. Understandably, some entrants to this colonial stock market sought to avoid brokers and preferred to try bucket shops or other utterly fraudulent investment schemes touting diamond opportunities for the less wealthy. Alas, unofficial channels for trading in colonial diamond shares were even more rife than the official ones with shell games and manipulation, leading many gullible Germans to invest heavily and to lose their shirts without any real possibility of legal redress. The result was a serious public loss of confidence in the stock market and in the government as it related to regulation and to capitalism. The result was also public anger about colonialism's selection of winners and losers among colonizers. By 1910, the bubble was bursting. and the loss of confidence in stock markets gave a valuable opening inside Germany to pan-German and anti-Semitic currents, and one can detect that current or those currents well after these colonial years, even as late as the 1930s. Colonial diamonds show up in that regard. The colonial corporation's magnificent good fortune recast the German colonial experience, leading to widespread debate about the extent to which German colonies were actually a fraud. A bait and switch in which promoters conjured air castles to attract investment, then absconded with profits and left others holding the bill. The latter perception emerged in part because of national psychology. In the 1880s, a herd mentality had predisposed a large portion of the German population to get in on a great colonial deal for fear of missing out. Getting in usually meant support for pro-colonial policies, and that support could come in many capacities. As politician, as banker, as citizen, as consumer, even as chancellor in the case of Bismarck. Actors at the state level hardly proved immune from the allure. They were also not sole or uniform perpetrators. The same was true of financiers. While some rightly rejected the idea that they were perpetrating a colonial fraud on the public, others really did encourage particular campaigns of colonial expansion under what they knew to be dubious pretexts. Nevertheless, someone in Europe, say a German population that supported colonial treaties tainted with fraud, always believed that they were pulling something over on less sophisticated dupes in other parts of the world. The dupes were supposed to be the colonized, the Africans, the Chinese, the Pacific Islanders. And the dupers were set to receive gold, gold, and still more gold, to quote contemporary Social Democrat August Bebel. Nearly every actor in this chain, because tolerant of fraud and complicit in a crime, was not only a potential victimizer, but an easy victim. European colonialism infamously reinforced ideas of social Darwinism, with putative winners among European states being divided into camps of the more and less strong. That same rule held for diverse German actors below the level of the state. From the bankers to the bakers, and even including the politicians fixing budgets, no one in this environment felt much compunction over someone who lost heavily in a bad deal. There are, of course, always constituencies making private gains off of the backs of the public, both in colonial settings and more broadly. But occurrences of fraud proved remarkably intrinsic to German colonial businesses. Grifters and con artists were a feature, not a bug, and fraud was intrinsic to and constitutive of the functioning of German colonial capitalism. Bismarck understood this dynamic in 1884. In that year, he embarked on his mysterious colonial experiment with the understanding that private companies and individuals would pay to exercise governmental functions under very loose and very inexpensive supervision from Berlin. Bismarck took a calculated risk that election gains for him, colonialism brought him, would outweigh the headaches associated with colonies he thought to be worthless. 5 years later, this same risk-taking had shown Bismarck, himself a would-be swindler, according to Friedrich Engels, to be a dupe of certain German business promoters who promised to do heavy colonial lifting and delivered little. A disillusioned Bismarck did not win sympathy from the public or a young Kaiser Wilhelm II for his colonial mistakes. Instead, as he complained about German colonialism's only achievement being, quote, the aggrandizement of millionaires, end quote, Bismarck lost his office. German colonialism can claim no explanatory phrase akin to the ones that have dominated Imperial German historiography. Perhaps the most famous such phrase came from a Prussian budget committee in 1862, when Bismarck told members of parliament that German unification would occur on the strength of iron and blood. In later years, scholars played on Bismarck's statement for assorted explanatory purposes. John Maynard Keynes gave us the image of coal and iron, which pointed to German mastery of these resources as the source of Germany's 19th century economic rise. Fritz Stern proposed gold and iron, a reminder of the mechanisms by which Bismarck's banker tenuously financed German wars. Eckhard Kehr's rye and iron summarized the influential alliance of industrial and agrarian interest groups, and even Neil Ferguson's paper and iron reassessed the relationship between monetary policy and industrial might. I would like to add blood and diamonds to this litany, and to argue that without keeping this particular pair in mind, it is difficult to make sense of Germany's colonial project. I submit that Germany's Imperial Illusions ultimately had a lot in common with the Diamond Illusion, one of humankind's most successful and sustained marketing campaigns. Recovering this connection can help us to understand why Germans pursued the conquest of colonial territory, even as financial rewards flowed to select groups and coincided with large frauds. For every ardent proponent of diamonds and colonies, convinced of capitalist returns and value, there were die-hard opponents whispering of worthlessness and cons. Perhaps Westerners' colonies, like their diamonds, were less about a rational program of economic development than about keeping up with the Joneses and doing something because peers were doing it. Britain, France, and the like were essentially big jewelry wearers in this context. A culture of imitation will also explain why contemporary theorists of German colonization describe their sites as a German Hong Kong, a German Kimberley, or a German India. This was a time, to quote the diplomat Hermann von Eckartstein, when high government officials seemingly found themselves consumed, quote, by a mania to acquire new colonies at any price, whether these colonies represented real objects of value or not, end quote. One needed only to replace the word colonies with diamonds to see the aptness of the parallel. As General Lothar von Schotte, the architect of genocide in Southwest Africa, put it privately in a letter, the German nation pursued colonies not with clear economic goals, but with the hope that something vaguely good would come of its possessions. Social advancement, fortune-making, heightened self-esteem. Diamonds were a mirror and a means of this desired appreciation and value through colonies. Finally, a note of 21st century relevance. In German Southwest Africa, blood and diamonds intersected amidst profound devastation for Herero, Nama, and Zan peoples. The specifics of this intersection should force us to revise our thinking about a contentious debate unfolding in the 21st century, whether and how Germany should make amends for the colonial period. The Nama diamond fields existed on land taken from the Nama through violence and through treaties made by Germans during the early time of colonial rule. After 1908, the Nama generated enormous wealth for a number of European constituencies, none of which were Nama or the other indigenous peoples of Namibia. Today, the world enjoys a century's worth, supply is still growing, of small, high-quality, and modestly expensive diamonds that Namibia provides to consumers rich and poor. At the same time, the Namibians from whose country diamond wealth is exported every year, and especially those Namibians who reside in communities near Lüderitz, the original site of German colonialism, live in abject poverty and have to drink water unfit for human consumption in many cases. To argue that history should not impinge on such contemporary questions of life and death is, I would submit, to buy into another illusion. Imperial Germany's diamonds were conflict or blood diamonds, for the concept existed, and so to an extent are the millions of diamonds extracted from the earth in Namibia since World War I, when Germany's colonial project came to an end, but where the Forbidden Zone still stands. Its German rules for exclusion intact and passed on by sale to the De Beers Company. German-Namibian relations should reflect on this economic history in addition to the violence that characterized German colonial rule. Thank you.